Hey guys, imagine being locked in a stone tower so high that birds use you as a landing strip. Your only view, a patch of sky the size of a coin, and your daily highlight is a rat that's become strangely affectionate. Welcome to the life nobody signed up for. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Part 1. Ascension and descent. The sun glinted off the gilded spires of the royal palace as Princess Eleanor waved to adoring crowds below, unaware that, within a single sunrise, her greatest dream of grandeur would transform into a masterclass in despair. One moment, she was draped in silks, fanned by servants. The next, her entourage disappeared into the shadows, and she found herself hoisted through a trapdoor into a pitch-black corridor. No warnings, no explanations. Just the rattling of chains and the distant drip of water. Congratulations, your first day in the royal tower. Enjoy the stone walls that never get wallpapered. In those early hours, Eleanor's most pressing concern was whether she should have worn slippers. After all, a princess needs proper footwear, even if the only floor she'll ever know is dust and, well, more dust. It was a lesson in planning. When plotting to overthrow your cousin the king, at least read the fine print on your arrest warrant. By noon, her silk gown had been replaced by a rough gray shift that could double as a medieval toga, minus the toga's flair. Instead of jeweled slippers, she got cold, damp flagstones. King's justice is blind, but it's also frigid, unforgiving, and odoriferous. Her room, a 12 by 8 foot chamber reminiscent of a poorly built rabbit hutch, with walls so thick you could have a dragon sneeze on the other side and still miss the echo. The single narrow window was barred, iron spikes perfect for lacing maces, not for letting in light. Yet each dawn she woke to the same glint of hope as the sun tried to poke its way through those bars, as if pleading, "I'm still here." And each dawn she realized hope was the cruelest part of survival, because hope reminds you how sweet freedom was. Within days, the princess learned that tower life is less castle in the sky and more dungeon in the fog. Her meals arrived in a wooden trough. Day 1, rotten porridge. Day 2, rotten porridge with a side of insects. Day 3, insect stew, seasoned with hopelessness. She considered elaborate escape plans, tossing her shift over the wall like a primitive lasso, bribing her rat companion for tunneling tips, but gave up when she discovered rats have no concept of loyalty unless you're packing cheese. Solidarity is cheap when it comes with cheese. Water came from a dripping pipe in the ceiling that made her feel like a petrified plant attending a drip irrigation seminar. On the bright side, bright, this water was raw, unfiltered, and enriched with trace minerals from generations of neglect. Each drop was a gift from the realm's most talented rock sculptors. The ceiling. Eleanor contemplated fashioning makeshift bowls from her shoes but shrugged. Those were long gone, sacrificed to the gods of practicality. As days stretched into weeks, the princess charted time by the regrowth of moss on her walls. On Mondays, the moss was just a whisper of green. By Fridays, it looked like the start of a successful forest. She wondered if the king paid any attention to the flourishing garden just outside her window. Probably not. After all, moss doesn't pay taxes, doesn't fight wars, and certainly doesn't wear crowns. Perfectly useless, exactly like her in the eyes of court politics. Nights were the worst. In the glaring absence of entertainment, no bards, no books, no Netflix, her mind became a theater of horrors. She counted ceiling stones until the numbers blurred, gave her rat a royal title, Sir Choose-a-Lot, and held court debates with the spiders that built webs and corners. They always voted against her proposals, citing a lack of any edible offerings. Even the spiders had standards. But the real terror came at midnight, when the tower's resident ghost, if rumors were to be believed, roamed the halls. Eleanor never confirmed or denied its existence. Sometimes the flicker of her candle and the cold breath at her neck were enough to keep the legend alive. And fear, after all, is the mind's greatest distraction. Yet in this absurd nightmare, Princess Eleanor discovered resourcefulness. And by resourcefulness, I mean she learned to pick locks with shredded bits of her shift, using rat teeth for leverage, practically a team-building exercise between species. She also mastered the art of persuasion, begging for breadcrumbs from channel rats, negotiating scraps in exchange for rat intelligence reports. Turns out they're excellent spies. She realized survival wasn't about swordplay or royal blood. It was about bargaining with anything that moved and occasionally begging door hinges to squeak in your favor. Her cell walls became canvases. With a broken spoon, she carved her name, her dreams, and snatches of poetry she half remembered from court entertainments. The inscriptions were both confessionals and timepieces. Day 10, I miss featherbeds. Day 22, I have not cried in 7 days. Surprise, tears are overrated. By the time chroniclers heard her story, the tower looked like a graffiti exhibit curated by someone who simultaneously adored and resented life. Meanwhile, outside, the court was having a regular Thursday. Gossip caravans rolled through the corridors. She's been moved to a tower garden. Nope, she's been executed. Not yet. She's channeled mystical energies and summoned a demon to overthrow the king. Where do people get these ideas? Each rumor was a lifeline and a noose. Lifeline if it distracted the guards. Noose if it prompted them to stuff her cell with more rats. She never knew which gossip would bring which result, but she learned to laugh it off, because in the shadow of despair, humor is the only rebellion left. It was on day 37 that Princess Eleanor received her first gift, a dead crow neatly wrapped in parchment. Inside, a note from an ally. Sorry about the bird. I thought it tasted awful, too. The message, I'm here. In that moment, she realized freedom was a collaborative art, requiring patience, cunning, and friends willing to test their culinary skills on the local wildlife. She tucked the note close to her heart, letting the ink stain her shift as a badge of hope. By the end of part 1, Eleanor was transformed. The pampered princess of legend had become a hardened strategist, bargaining with beasts, mapping secret tunnels in her head, and laughing at the notion of delicate propriety. She developed a taste for cold porridge and an aversion to polite society. Her dreams shifted from ballrooms to blueprints, from silk gowns to improvised armor made of hope in stolen metal shards. So, here's to the princess who never left the tower, yet somehow conquered an empire of despair, with a rat as her lieutenant, moss as her calendar, and sheer stubbornness as her sword. Stick around for part 2, where we'll explore her daring midnight escapade that involved a guard, a rope made of torn tapestries, and a revelation that kings really should invest in better locks. Because when the absurdity of history knocks, you either answer with steel, wit, or sheer ridiculous laughter. And Princess Eleanor chose all three. The moon hovered above the tower like an inspecting magistrate, cold, distant, and utterly unhelpful. Inside, Princess Eleanor crouched in the corner of her cell, clutching her rat lieutenant, Sir Chooselot, who seemed less an animal and more a furry co-conspirator. Tonight was the night she would flee her stone prison, shove the king's guards into chaos, and ideally loot the royal treasury on the way out, or at least snag an apple. Goals can scale to circumstances. Her rope was ready. She had spent 2 weeks painstakingly tearing the tapestries from the walls, those faded depictions of long-forgotten victories, and braiding them into a makeshift cord. Each night, she added a new strand, whispering motivational quotes like, "If life gives you wool, make rope," and "A princess in flight outranks a princess in bed." The result was less elegant than purpose-made rope, but promising enough. It was roughly the thickness of a sausage and twice as lumpy, but it would have to do. Step 1. Distract the guard. Eleanor knew her jailer, Klaus the broad-shouldered, was predictable. He did his rounds at exactly 2:07 a.m., humming a tavern song horribly out of tune. He was the sort of guard who believed in punctuality and disdain for rats. Both beliefs could be exploited. Eleanor positioned Sir Chooselot by the door, adorning him with the smallest scrap of cheese she could trade for a rat intelligence report. The plan. At 2:06, Sir Chooselot would launch a coordinated assault on Klaus's boot, triggering the guard's greatest phobia, rodent chaos, while Eleanor slipped out her shift rope and began the descent. She gave her lieutenant a firm pat. Rule number 1 of espionage. Look terrifying, she whispered, before tossing him toward the door. At precisely 2:07, Klaus paused in front of the cell, yawning so wide his helmet nearly fell off. His boots creaked close to the threshold, and Eleanor's heart drummed like an overzealous drummer. She bit her lip and forced her hands to remain still. In the silence, she could hear Klaus's own heartbeat, slow, sleepy, and regrettably calm. And then, a series of high-pitched shrieks and the frantic thumping of tiny feet. Sir Chooselot, emboldened by cheese, had launched himself against Klaus's shin. The guard yelped like a startled cow, flailed his halberd, and hopped back 3 paces, his helmet clattering to the floor. Eleanor seized her chance. She flung open the cell door, her makeshift hinges, lubricated nightly with water and old porridge, groaned in protest, and slipped into the corridor, rope trailing behind her like a mangy scarf. She scurried along the wall, following the path she'd memorized from days of boredom. 2 turns, a left at the mossy stone with a faint drip above it, and then a dead end where a loose brick concealed a narrow air vent. In daylight it was useless, but shown by torchlight it revealed the perfect, if claustrophobic, escape route. Behind her, Klaus stomped, shouting, "Stop! Thief! Princess!" which sounded absurd when shouted in the bowels of the tower, but did attract the attention of 2 more guards. Eleanor's pulse danced a jig as she shoved the loose brick aside and squeezed into the damp vent. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and regret. She clutched her rope and began inching through the tunnel, muscles quivering. Sir Chooselot perched on her shoulder, his beady eyes glowing like a small lantern of mutiny. After what felt like an eternity of crouching, she emerged into the inner courtyard, an overgrown, cobweb-laden mess that the court gardeners apparently forgot existed. Vines clung to statues of kings long past, and puddles reflected the moonlight in nauseatingly beautiful patterns. Eleanor paused to consider her handiwork. She had executed a daring prison break with the panache of a court jester and the grace of a mud-covered goat. But there was no time for self-congratulation. The courtyard gate lay ahead. She looped the tapestry rope around a protruding stone pillar, tested its strength, no snapping yet, and began her descent toward the cobblestones 20 feet below. The rope stretched alarmingly, like a puddle that refuses to evaporate, but it held. Midway down, she lost her nerve and froze, dangling like an oversized fruit. Her thighs trembled, her hands slick with sweat. Above, the shadows coalesced into a shape that looked suspiciously like a hawk, probably a pigeon, but all shapes look menacing at night. Eleanor whispered to her rope, "Don't fail me now." An inch downward again. She hit the ground with a graceless thud that would have registered on any nearby seismograph. Sir Chooselot leapt off her shoulder, shook himself like a miniature lion, and scurried into the underbrush. Eleanor dusted off her shift, already torn to a functional half-shift, and pressed on. The main gate was protected by a sliding heavy wooden door, operated by a simple lever tucked under a guard booth. Eleanor's map of the courtyard, etched in moss on her cell wall, had indicated the guard booth was always empty at this hour. Klaus and his friends preferred moonlit karaoke in the mess hall, the perfect window of opportunity. She crept to the booth, slid under the door, and crouched behind a barrel of pickled onions, leftover from last month's failed winter festival. The lever was just within reach, cold iron with grease smeared by careless soldiers. Eleanor looped a finger around it and pulled. The gate groaned, crashing open to reveal the kingdom's outer wall. A massive expanse of stone, topped by spikes and patrolled by more guards who hadn't gotten the memo about karaoke schedules. She peered out. The guard in sight was patently uninterested in onion barrels. He was busy arguing with the moon. His back was turned. This was the moment. Eleanor took a deep breath, laced with the aroma of fermented onions, and dashed through the gate, ducking into the shadow of the outer wall. She felt a surge of triumph so intense it almost knocked her over. Liberty tasted like vinegar and fear, but she was free. Freedom, of course, is overrated if you have nowhere to go. Eleanor knew the kingdom's borders, forests on one side, a swamp on the other, and a cliff that dropped into the sea, none of which seemed particularly inviting at night. She needed a destination somewhere with food, and ideally a horse. Keynesian economics had not covered horse acquisition under duress, so she improvised, head for the stables. The stables lay just beyond the wall, their silhouette marked by the faint neighing of disgruntled horses. Eleanor slipped in through a broken window. Why they maintained these facilities with such shoddy carpentry was beyond her, and found herself surrounded by expectant equines. Sir Chooselot chattered in her ear, pointing out that horses were massive, unpredictable beasts, and generally not into midnight intrusion. But desperation required risk. She lured the nearest steed with a handful of stale porridge pellets she'd pocketed from dinner. The horse eyed her suspiciously, but gobbled them nonetheless, and allowed her to hang a crude makeshift bridle around its muzzle. Mounting was another matter. The horse was taller than Eleanor remembered, and she lacked the leverage of a boot on a stair. She attempted a running leap, which ended in her tumbling onto the dirt floor like yesterday's laundry. The horse snorted in disapproval. Eleanor massaged her bruised backside and tried again. This time, with one foot pressed against the stall door's low beam. She heaved herself up, landing with a graceless plop that set the horse to stamping in alarm. She whispered apologies, patted its neck, and nudged it toward the broken stall door. Outside, the air was chilly, carrying the scent of pine and promise. She flicked her shift-turned saddle blanket over the horse's back, gripped the reins, and nudged it forward. The horse lumbered through the gate, and Eleanor exhaled, only to inhale a sharp gasp when a torch beam swept across the stable yard. A guard, Klaus. He had tracked her, improvised detective that he was, following the rat's squeaks and porridge crumbs. He raised his halberd. Eleanor froze. The horse froze. Sir Chooselot froze. Somewhere a cricket stopped singing. She had two options: plead like a terrified child or charge like a madwoman. She chose the latter. With a guttural scream that borrowed from ancient war cries and binge-watching too many epic fantasies, she urged the horse forward. It bolted right through the gate, sending the guard sprawling in a cloud of onion-scented dust. They thundered down the path, hooves tearing at loose gravel as more torches flared behind them. Eleanor clutched her braided tapestry rope. It might come in handy, and held on for dear life. Behind her, the courtyard gate slammed open as other guards realized the princess had mutated into a one-woman cavalry. Eleanor kicked the horse's flanks. It obeyed with a startled neigh, and they galloped toward the forest edge. Trees shattered the wind with a cacophony only nature can compose. Branches slapped at Eleanor's face. Roots threatened to break the horse's legs. She urged it deeper into the woods, praying her childhood memories of riding lessons. Mostly riding sticks and pretending the stable broom was a steed would translate to actual equestrian skill. They burst through a thicket into a moonlit clearing, and Eleanor dared to look back. Torchlight danced at the forest's mouth, small flickering embers of her pursuer's rage. She patted the horse's neck. "Not bad for a princess," she murmured. The horse snorted as if to say, "Spare me the compliments." She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't return to court, couldn't face execution, or worse, polite exile to a comfortable cottage. Better to be lost in the wilderness than a puppet on a chain. So she rode north toward rumored allies beyond the marshlands. She named her horse Tapestry, in honor of the rope that started this adventure. Tapestry had opinions, expressed via ear flicks and nickers, but no objections to the plan. At dawn they reached a river. The current glimmered like liquid silver, and Eleanor realized she had no skill in river crossings. She dismounted, led Tapestry into the shallows, and tested the footing. Rocks were slippery. Water was cold enough to prompt shrieks from even the hardiest traveler. They pressed on, and the river fought them, each hoof stall sinking into mud, each step forward, a negotiation with gravity. At last, they emerged on the opposite bank, water dripping from Tapestry's mane, chest deep in triumph. Eleanor hoisted herself onto the horse and surveyed the horizon. A vast expanse of wild land, unclaimed and indifferent. Everything she owned, crown, title, silk shifts, laid behind her in a tower now echoing with rumors of her demise. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and possibly a decent meal, if they could find a cook who didn't mind half-drowned royals. And so Princess Eleanor rode into legend, not as a pampered gilded ornament, but as a creature of grit, absurdity, and surprising equine diplomacy. She had escaped her stone cage, outsmarted guards, befriended rats, and tamed a horse with porridge bribes. She was a warning to kings: invest in better locks, or you might find your princess riding off into the sunset, laughing, free, and possibly searching for cheese. Stay tuned for part 3, where Eleanor navigates the treacherous swamp of Whispering Willows, negotiates with smugglers who love riddles, and uncovers a scandal that will make the court wish they just left her in the tower. The dawn mist clung to the gnarled trunks of the Whispering Willows, like a secretive lover refusing to let go. Princess Eleanor, now better known by smugglers, peddlers, and one very confused village goat as that royal skunk, steady in the saddle atop Tapestry, peered into the verdant gloom. Every willow branch seemed to quiver with hushed voices as though the swamp itself mulled over, whether to swallow her whole or merely tickle her ankles before letting her pass. Eleanor dismounted, sensing that horses and swamps have the diplomatic finesse of toddlers in a pottery shop. She led Tapestry onto a narrow spit of muddy shoreline, where reeds whispered like nosy servants. The water was black as ink, the kind scribes used to forge imperial decrees. A slight tug on Eleanor's shift reminded her that this garment, once a silk tapestry of courtly elegance, had been reduced to a shredded banner of survival. She tugged it again, prompting an appreciative snort from her horse. A lantern bobbled in the distance, its warm glow flickering against the dripping trees. Eleanor approached, raising a hand in cautious greeting. A figure emerged, a wiry man with a roguish grin, wearing a cloak patched with mismatched fabrics and a hat adorned with— "Was that a chicken feather? You seeking safe passage?" he rasped, voiced a syrupy concoction of curiosity and caution. "Safe-ish passage," Eleanor corrected. "I'll settle for less likely to be eaten by swamp creatures," she added, remembering the half-eaten boot she discovered outside her tower the previous week. He chuckled, revealing teeth that had clearly been smuggled out of a dentist's remit. "I'm Fenric. These parts are my business. Smuggling goods, secrets, people with poor life choices. You want to cross the swamp?" "Depends on the rate," Eleanor replied, "and whether you charge extra for leading a princess toward her doom." Fenric winked. "Princesses get a discount. Swamp lore says you're worth more alive." He held out a grubby hand. Eleanor considered formalities. Shaking with a hand coated in swamp muck broke every royal protocol she'd ever known. But she obliged. The handshake lasted long enough for Eleanor to question every life decision that led to this moment. "Follow the lanterns," Fenric instructed, nodding toward a procession of dim lights stretching deeper into the willows. "Answer my riddles at each waypoint and we'll get you across." "Because riddles in a swamp never lead to death," Eleanor muttered, but she followed. At the first lantern, a squat woman with arms like braided rope blocked the path. "Riddle me," she commanded. Eleanor squared her shoulders. Her tutor had drilled poetry and philosophy, but never swamp riddles. She took a breath. "I speak without a mouth and hear without ears. I have nobody, but I come alive with wind. What am I?" The woman snorted as though insulted. "Echo." The lantern glowed brighter and the path opened. Eleanor nodded and pressed on. 2 lanterns farther, a child's voice challenged her. "What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening?" Eleanor smiled. Man crawling as a baby, walking upright as an adult, using a cane in old age. The child giggled, vanishing into the shadows. A bridge of rotting planks materialized. Eleanor tested the first board, which creaked ominously. She hovered on one foot, then plunged across, tapestry following with less grace. At the final lantern, Fenric reappeared, arms folded. Last riddle. Feed me and I live. Give me a drink and I die. What am I? Eleanor paused theatrically. Fire. The swamp sighed as though relieved, parting to reveal solid ground. Fenric bowed. Congratulations. Not many solve all three. Eleanor clambered aboard tapestry. Let on, she said, before I change my mind and decide swamps aren't so bad. They emerged at a hidden cove where a skiff bobbed gently. Two smugglers, twins if looks could kill, eyed her shift with suspicion. Princess or new cargo, one asked. Both, Eleanor quipped, vaulting into the boat. The skiff slid onto the water, Fenric pushing it off with a long pull. Under her breath, Eleanor confessed to Tapestry. Trust me, you'll prefer dry land. The horse snorted in disagreement, flicking its tail at the mosquitoes. The skiff drifted toward a pier carved into the cliff's foot. Behind the veneer of smug hospitality, Eleanor sensed tension. She'd heard that word meant people whispering behind your back. Before she could investigate, her attention snapped to a clandestine meeting at the pier's end. A cloaked figure slipping a sealed scroll into a guard captain's hand. Her mind whirled. That scroll looked suspiciously like a royal decree and not one authorizing her release, more like an order for her permanent disposal. Eleanor sank lower in the boat. We have company, she murmured. Fenric growled. Captain Dougal doesn't trust me or you. If he recognizes you, he'll raise the alarm. We must move. Understood, Eleanor said, though she hadn't decided the best way to move a horse in a skiff. The twin smugglers worked in seamless choreography, looping ropes around Tapestry's legs, calming the beast with whispered carrots. No one had told Eleanor to saddle up for carrot hoarding, but she'd improvised. The boat pushed away just as Dougal shouted, "Stop that boat!" A cannon crack echoed, more for theatrical effect than accuracy, sending water spraying. Eleanor shrieked, "That's water, not friendly." The twins rowed faster, Fenric whistling a discordant tune that only made the swamp wind hiss in disapproval. As they rounded the cliff, the coast opened into a secret cove of crystalline waters and white sand, a tropical paradise that looked nothing like her kingdom. Palms whispered promises of coconuts and sunlight. Eleanor blinked. Where am I? Safe haven for misfits, Fenric replied. They call it Haven's Watch. No kings, no politics, just oddballs and fugitives. She scanned the crowds, former mercenaries selling forged passports, runaway scholars peddling banned books, and a troupe of musicians who insisted on performing interpretive dances about poultry. A weeping monk peddled transcendence elixir, basically swamp water with herbs. Eleanor dismounted. I'll have one of those elixirs, she declared, approaching the monk. He sniffed her shift, then bowed. For you, princess, discounted price, plus a free lesson in existential dread. She laughed, a genuine sound that startled a nearby pelican. Make it two. As she sipped the elixir, her eyes fell on a tattered banner fluttering above a makeshift tavern. The Gilded Rat. A small sign read, "Princess is welcome, but rats are better customers." Sir Choose-a-Lot scampered ahead. Inside, lanterns bathed crooked tables in warm light. Eleanor took a seat, tapestry tied to a beam outside. A wiry bartender slid her a mug of frothy ale. "On the house," he said. "Word travels fast." She took a sip, feeling the vanilla warmth of freedom slide down her throat. "I need information." He leaned in. "The guard, Captain Dougal, has your scroll, an execution warrant signed by King Bastion himself. But rumor says the king never intended you dead, just locked away where no one could remember you." Eleanor's jaw tensed. "So I'm a footnote in my own kingdom's history?" "More like a ghost," he said. "But there's talk of a coup. Noble houses whisper, replacing the king with a puppet queen, namely you." Her eyebrows shot up. "Me? Puppet queen?" He nodded. "They need your name to legitimize their power, but they'll kill you first if you resist." Eleanor drained her mug. The world had a way of getting complicated. First she was tower-bound, then she became an escape artist. Now she was a potential figurehead for a palace uprising. "What do they want from me?" she asked. "Your voice," he said. "Your name. They'll parade you in public, claim you as their champion. Then you'll rule until they toss you aside." Eleanor considered her shift, her rope, her rat, her horse. "I'd rather rule a swamp," she said. "But if they want me, I can use leverage," he smirked. "That's the spirit. Welcome to political theater." As the tavern's motley patrons sang bawdy sea shanties, some about princesses, some about suspiciously anthropomorphic rats, Eleanor plotted her next move. She had crossed a swamp, outwitted guards, tamed a horse, and sneakily sipped existential dread. Now she faced a scandal that could topple kingdoms or hang her by her own shift. But one thing was clear. Whether she chose to be queen, rebel, or professional swamp consultant, she'd do it on her own absurd terms, and perhaps later invest in sturdier shifts, because paper-thin fabric and political intrigue were not a good combination. Stay tuned for Part 4, where alliances will unravel, truths will sting harder than rat bites, and Princess Eleanor will discover that history's cruelest twist is realizing you're only a character in someone else's play, unless you grab the quill and rewrite the script yourself. The first light of dawn painted the sky in bruised purples and pinks. As Princess Eleanor emerged from the goated rat, the salty breeze of havens watched tangling her hair into knots worthy of court gossip. She mounted Tapestry, whose ears twitched at the unfamiliar sense of sea and spice drifting from the docks. Behind her, Sir Choose-a-Lot performed a victory lap around the tavern's signpost, drawing amused glances from early rising merchants. Today, she thought wryly, the world expected her to decide whether to be puppet or playwright of her own fate. Her first appointment was with the conspirators who'd spirited her here, a council of disgruntled nobles, exiled scribes, and one particularly persuasive jester named Marlowe, whose half-painted face and manic grin suggested he'd lost at least 3 funerals in 1 week. They waited in a cavernous hall carved from coral-white stone, its windows offering a panoramic view of the turquoise bay. Eleanor dismounted and smoothed her tattered shift, now officially regarded as royal chic by her reluctant allies. Marlowe bounded forward, producing a loaf of bread that smelled faintly of seaweed and rebellion. "Princess," he exclaimed, tossing her a chunk. "Eat. We have much to plot, and I insist on proper nutrition for the person whose coronation I will be hosting." She took a bite. The bread was stale, but she ate with the enthusiasm of someone who'd survived rat-bribed lockpicking horses drenched in swamp water, and existential swamp elixirs. "Thank you," she said, chewing. "Now let's talk power plays." Across the table, Lord Ashcroft, an ex-admiral with one eye and 3 retired peg legs. The fourth, he claimed, had wandered off in a drunken gamble, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," he began with a bow so deep his hair nearly kissed the floor. "The plan is simple. We present you to the people as the rightful heir, imprisoned unjustly, betrayed by your own blood. Their sympathy will be our leverage." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "My own blood? You mean cousin King Bastion?" She glanced at Marlowe, who bit his lip to stifle a snort. "He's family. I'd prefer not to see him lobbed into a swamp or anything." Lord Ashcroft waved away her concerns. "He won't be harmed much. We simply need him distracted. While you're paraded through the streets singing your tragic tale, we'll seize the palace gates. The people will welcome you. Then we negotiate terms." She tapped her fingers. "And if the people realize I'm just a figurehead?" Marlowe tilted his head, considering. "Then you'll remind them that figureheads write history too." A murmur of approval swept the room. Eleanor glanced at Marlowe's painted smile and suppressed a shudder. Clowns were the worst. "Very well," she said, "but I have conditions." The room stiffened as though she just requested double rations of rats for breakfast. "First, I won't be dressed like some martyr. No more half-rags. I want the silk shift I came here in, or something better. Second, I retain veto power over any laws passed in my name. Third, I require a rat ambassador. Sir Chooselot's diplomatic skills are unparalleled. And frankly, I need him as a morale officer." They exchanged glances. Then Ashcroft bowed again. "Granted," Marlowe squealed, "and we'll commission you a crown made of reinforced steel. No more flimsy wood." Eleanor smiled, teeth chattering at the thought of wearing metal atop her head. "Excellent. Let's proceed." 2 days later, the docks of Haven's watch thrummed with activity. Fishermen unloaded nets, smugglers stowed crates of questionable origin, and street performers juggled everything from flaming torches to live fish. At the pier's end, scaffolds had been erected in haste, banners flown proudly above them bearing Eleanor's crest, a rat clutching a key over a shattered tower. Eleanor stood behind a velvet curtain in a modest pavilion, gazing out at the crowd. Among them were exiles, runaway scholars, and at least one goat who seemed to have become a local celebrity. Tapestry stood calm and dignified, tethered to a post beside a gilded litter. Marlowe fluttered around her, fussing over her hairstyle. "You must look tragic yet hopeful, like a flower rising from rubbish," he instructed, pinning a jeweled comb into her hair. She sighed. "I look like a frantic bird in a jewelry store," he winked. "Precisely." Ashcroft approached, carrying her new silk shift, dyed the color of storm clouds, and a small steel circlet encrusted with black gems. "Your shift, Your Highness," he said, laying the fabric across her arm, "and your crown." Eleanor lifted the shift, feeling its softness, then held the circlet in her palm. She caught a reflection in a polished shield, tower-hardened eyes, a dusty braid, and the faintest ghost of a smile. "Thank you," she murmured. "Let's give them a show." As the drums began, 5 booming beats that echoed against the water, Ashcroft pulled the curtain aside. Eleanor stepped forward, rodent-like in her poise, balustrade beneath her carved with scenes of ancient heroes. The crowd hushed, a sea of faces lit by torchlight and raw curiosity. She raised a hand. People of Haven's Watch, exiles, refugees, and wayward goats, thank you for gathering on this fine morning when the tide of history turns. A cheer rose. I'm Princess Eleanor, unjustly imprisoned by my cousin, King Bastion, to vanish from memory. But memory is stubborn. She paused, letting the words sink in. They thought a tower could silence me. They thought rats and moss and darkness might break my spirit. Instead, those very things taught me resilience. The crowd murmured. Eleanor glanced at Sir Chooselot, perched on her shoulder. He chittered supportively. I stood against rot and despair, against guards and ghosts, and I survived. Because hope is more than a glimmer. It's a fortress built from absurdity and grit. Another cheer. She had them, and now she lifted her crown. I wear a circlet forged not from lofty ceremony, but from the steel of my resolve. She placed it on her head. It fit snugly, surprisingly comfortable. But I refused to be a puppet. If you crown me queen, I demand a kingdom rebuilt on fairness, on remembrance of the lost, on locks that keep out traitors, and on celebrations so grand no rat will ever feel lonely again. The crowd roared. Goat bleated in approval. Meanwhile, across the bay in the capital city, King Bastion received word of the coronation spectacle. He paced his opulent study, silk drapes billowing like wounded sails. His advisors clustered anxiously. Your Majesty, they've crowned her in exile. The people adore her. The jesters painting rats on banners. Bastion paused, stroking his beard. Rats on banners, you say? His advisors stammered. Yes, sire. He tapped a finger on his desk. Send word that we welcome her return to serve as ambassador of goodwill. An advisor's face drained. But sire, that's effectively surrender. He waved dismissively. Not surrender, strategy. Bring her home. Let her see the palace isn't a prison. Then he tapped again. We've finished negotiations. Back in Haven's Watch, the jubilee continued with feasts of dried fish. Stale bread turned into adventurous stews and mugs of ale that tasted like freedom mixed with seawater. Eleanor sat on a dais surrounded by her council. Marlowe in full court jester regalia, including bells that jingled obnoxiously, performed somersaults for the masses. Even the goat wore a tiny circlet. Ashcroft approached her, voice low. We've received Bastion's invitation. He proposes a parley, exchange hostages, negotiate borders, and perhaps restore certain family ties. Eleanor stared at him. He wants me back. To tame me? He shrugged. Perhaps. Or maybe he's afraid you'll declare war. She leaned back, tasting the salty air. I'd rather broker peace than declare war, but I won't return shackled by protocol. Marlowe somersaulted over. We have a boat ready and a welcome committee. Your old tutor is weeping outside the palace gates. He held up a soggy handkerchief. She sends muffins. Eleanor smiled. Then let's sail at first light. She patted Sir Chooselot, who preened imperiously. Looks like we're going home. The journey back was quiet, save for the lapping of waves against the hull. Eleanor sat on a crate, the sea breeze tangling her hair. Tapestry stowed below deck with straw, munched hay contentedly. Sir Chooselot explored the rafters, plotting his next intelligence report. She thought of the tower, the swamp, the conspirators, and realized that every indignity, Every rat-fueled negotiation, every blade-thin escape had led to this moment. When the palace came into view, towers glinting in morning light, banners snapping in the wind, Eleanor straightened. She would face her cousin not as a trembling captive, but as a sovereign in spirit. She would rewrite her story not with ink alone, but with actions. A queen who had tamed despair, who negotiated with rats and spies alike, who refused to be merely remembered, insisted on being reckoned with. As the boat slipped into the palace harbor and her childhood tutor rushed forward, Eleanor stood tall. The world had cast her as prisoner, escapee, puppet, and queen. But at last, she would take the quill, carve her own legend, and prove that a princess who conquered towers, swamps, and political theater could rule not from fear, but from absurdity, turned into triumph. And thus, with the echo of hooves, the chatter of a rat diplomat, and the clang of a steel circlet, Princess Eleanor returned, not to the cage, but to the crown she had earned. Hey y'all, imagine riding for days with prickly saddle sores, stampeding cattle charging like caffeinated bowls, and your breakfast consisting of dust-flavored biscuit dough. Think you'd survive? Well, buckle up. Literally. Because today we're diving headfirst into why you wouldn't last a week as a cowboy on a cattle drive. Part 1. The dust, the sweat, the unrelenting sun. Hit it, partner. The trail boss bellows. You mount your horse. It's less mount, more cling explosives that buck fractiously. And the journey begins. The cattle herd stretches to the horizon. A sea of grunting, drooling beasts with horns like medieval weapons. Your job? Keep them moving, keep them together, and prevent mass chaos. Not a small feat when a bored steer decides it's time for a detour into thorn bushes. Day 1 is a rude awakening. The sun beats down like a blacksmith's hammer. You sweat through your vest, your hat, even your soul. Every muscle protests. You realize your horse is covered in dust. You are coated in dust. Even your tears taste like dust. The trail boss yells, and you lurch into action, corralling rambunctious cattle. A rogue calf veers left. The next moment's a ballet of whistles and whips and tiny hooves, all reminding you that discipline is just a euphemism for run like hell. By lunch, you realize your biscuit tastes like gravel. Your coffee is a warm slurry that probably doubles as cattle feed, and your water is thick with alkaline grit. But hydration is non-negotiable. This desert sun drains you faster than a gambler's coin purse. You drink and gag and nod to your trail buddies, who all do the same, looking like zombies who stumbled into a rancher's wet dream. Mid-afternoon brings the first cattle drama. A steer named Big Earl decides to brawl with his neighbor, Jesus. Coincidence or divine intervention? You and your fellow drovers are suddenly referees in a hoof and horn duel, shouting, waving lassos, and hoping nobody gets impaled. You tire yourself out separating bruised bovines. But let your guard down and suddenly you're playing leapfrog over cow patties. Now your boots are caked in something that gives new meaning to ranch dressing. For dinner, you settle on beans, bacon, and trail stew, which is basically anything left over from last week, compressed into a single pot. Add more grit than flavor. You soldier through, knowing tomorrow you'll do it all again, but with the added bonus of sore shoulders and horses that smell like wet dog and regret. That night, you camp under the stars, which might sound dreamy, until you realize each star's chilly light mocks your aching body. Coyotes howl and punctuate your exhaustion. You curl in your bedroll, less a comfortable sack, more the strip mall equivalent of mattress, only to be awakened at 2 a.m. because a batch of calves decided to stampede. You scramble out, half asleep, swatting hooves in dust until dawn shows up like a relentless guard at a prison gate. And oh, the gear. Jeans that rub blisters raw. Chaps that chafe like they're plotting revenge. Hats that shade your eyes but also collect dust like industrial lint traps. Every item was supposed to help. But after a day in the saddle, you wonder if cowboy gear was a prank invented by sadistic ranchers. So if you think life as a cowboy sounds romantic, remember, behind the hats and dusty sunsets lay a trial by fire. You battle sun, gravel, cattle rebellion, and bodily breakdown, all for barely enough pay to get back to your hometown saloon for 2 drinks and a stiff apology to your mother for smelling like a barn. Morning on the cattle drive arrives, not with a gentle rooster's crow or the soothing warmth of a sunrise, but with a boot to the ribs and the trail boss barking, "Up you lazy sons of dust buckets." We ride. You wake half-conscious, body sore in places you didn't know could hurt, and your face so caked in dirt you resemble a rejected sculpture. The cattle are already restless, lowing and stomping as if they too resent the idea of another day of this nonsense. Breakfast is exactly what you feared, leftover beans mixed with something charitably referred to as coffee, though it smells like burnt sorrow and tastes like river sludge. The cook, an old codger known only as Biscuit Jim, ladles you a cup while making deadpan eye contact, as if daring you to complain. You don't. No one ever complains to Biscuit Jim. As you attempt to choke down the liquid punishment, the first sign of trouble slithers into camp. A rattlesnake, fat and lazy from last night's warmth. It curls near the fire, and a greenhorn cowboy named Deke tries to shoo it away with a stick. This goes about as well as expected. The snake lashes out, Deke squeals like a tea kettle, and the camp erupts into chaos. Pistols are drawn. Someone fires a shot that takes out the coffee pot instead. In a matter of 30 seconds, you've lost the only source of caffeine. A snake's been murdered in a frankly overdramatic fashion, and Biscuit Jim swears vengeance on whoever wasted perfectly good coffee, snake or no snake. After the crisis subsides and the snake's remains are unceremoniously flung into a bush, you saddle up again. Your horse, aptly named Spite, glares at you with the weary loathing of a creature who knows you'll blame him for every bad thing that happens today. You set off down the trail, dust already clouding your lungs, sun climbing the sky like a celestial sadist eager to scorch every exposed inch of your body. The heat intensifies, sweat soaks your shirt, your hat feels like a portable oven, and the cattle begin to stagger. You're tasked with tailing the herd, which means you ride behind the main pack, breathing in a constant storm of dust, manure particles, and your own fading will to live. The only things worse than the heat are the flies. There are flies everywhere, on the cattle, on your face, in your mouth. You swat at them like a man possessed, but it's a losing battle. By noon, the trail boss calls a halt at a river crossing. It looks deceptively serene, but every cowboy worth his chaps knows that rivers are nature's ambush predators. Beneath that gentle surface lie slick rocks, hidden holes and currents eager to drag a man to a muddy grave. The cattle hesitate, snorting and stamping at the water's edge. The crossing begins in what can only be described as a symphony of wet chaos. The steers bellow and charge, some bolting back toward the shore, others plunging ahead like bovine torpedoes. You're ordered to ride alongside them, shouting and waving your lasso to keep the herd together. This sounds heroic in theory, but feels more like drowning with extra steps. Spite refuses to enter the water without a fight. You dig your heels in, he bucks, you nearly fall off, and by the time you're both chest deep in the river, you're questioning every decision that brought you to this moment. The water is frigid, the current pulls at your legs, and a log brushes past you in a way that makes you briefly wonder if you'll be dragged under and found 3 days later, downstream, still clinging to your hat. As you finally reach the opposite bank, drenched and shivering, you realize one of the cattle has gotten itself lodged between two rocks midstream. The trail boss bellows at you to get it out. You dismount, stumble through the shallows and wrestle with the panicked beast, while the river does its best to carry you both to oblivion. After what feels like an hour but is probably 6 miserable minutes, you free the steer, lose a boot, and climb back onto Spite, who has taken this opportunity to roll in mud and now looks like a 4-legged dirtball. Evening falls. The cattle graze. The cook slaps together another uninspired meal, and Biscuit Jim salvages what's left of the coffee grounds to make something so bitter it could strip paint off a wagon wheel. You drink it anyway because survival is no longer about comfort, it's about spite. You sit by the fire, boots drying, clothes stiff with river grime, as the older cowboys swap stories about things that tried to kill them. Snakes, wolves, drought, and once, allegedly, a particularly aggressive chicken. Night on the trail is its own private hell. Coyotes circle just beyond the firelight, their yips unsettling. The cattle, spooked by every shifting shadow, are prone to stampedes. If one starts, it's up to you to leap onto Spite, ride into a moving wall of hooves and horns, and turn the herd before they scatter into the dark or trample you flat. This happens twice before midnight. You're assigned watch shift runs from 2 a.m. to dawn. You sit alone on the edge of camp, hat pulled low, rifle across your lap, eyes stinging from smoke and exhaustion. Every rustle makes your skin crawl. Is it a snake? A mountain lion? Or worse, another cowboy looking to trade shifts? Dawn breaks in streaks of crimson and gold. You've slept a total of 40 minutes. Your joints feel fused. Your mouth tastes like boiled saddle leather. And Biscuit Jim hands you a cup of liquid despair that passes for coffee. There's no rest. The trail boss shouts, "The cattle must move." This is the point where you realize that the romanticized image of cowboy life, the sunsets, the freedom, the camaraderie, is a filthy lie. There's no freedom when your survival depends on keeping hundreds of idiot animals from stampeding, when every meal is a guess, and when every sunrise means your bones will ache just a little more. Yet you saddle up, because what else can you do? You made it this far, and somehow you suspect it's going to get worse. By the 3rd week on the cattle drive, you're no longer a person. You're a moving collection of bruises, blisters, and dust, barely held together by spite and whatever godforsaken substance Biscuit Jim keeps putting in the coffee. The novelty has long since worn off. Every sunset looks the same, every sunrise feels like a slap, and you've developed a sixth sense for which steer is about to do something stupid. It starts with rain, not a gentle drizzle or a picturesque sprinkle. No, this is Old Testament rain, the kind that makes you start mentally measuring cubits and eyeing the livestock for pairs. 1 minute it's dry, the next the sky cracks open and dumps an ocean on your head. Within moments, the trail turns to slop. Your clothes cling to you like cold, wet bandages, and your hat collapses into something resembling a wilted pancake. The cattle hate rain. They get spooked, confused, and prone to bolting at the slightest provocation. which in this case is thunder so loud it sounds like the sky's falling apart. The herd surges, slipping and bellowing, hooves churning mud into a soupy death trap. You're ordered to circle them, but your horse, Spite, has decided he wants no part of it and spends the first 10 minutes trying to bolt for Mexico. You finally wrangle him into formation, and what follows is a 6-hour blur of shouting, galloping, and sheer blind terror. Cattle fall, get stuck, and thrash like panicked toddlers in a mud puddle. You lose track of how many times you almost get trampled. Your rifle soaked. Your boots are filled with water and regret, and you can no longer remember what it feels like to be dry. Then you hit the quicksand. Nobody tells you where the quicksand is because, frankly, most of the cowboys don't know. They just remember where someone got swallowed last year. But when the ground suddenly shifts under Spite and the both of you start sinking like a pair of particularly unlucky anchors, it becomes clear you found it. Panic is not an option, because the second you flail or scream, you'll sink faster. You clutch the saddle horn, curse every decision that led you here, and kick free as Spite flails his way to firmer ground. You crawl after him, soaked and shaking, only to find a cow named Petunia staring at you like you're the dumbest creature alive. By some miracle, the herd survives the storm. You drag yourself back to camp, where Biscuit Jim greets you with what he insists is rain stew. It's mostly beans floating in runoff, but you eat it anyway because the only other option is starvation. Nobody talks much that night. Everyone's too cold, too wet, too bone-tired. And then comes the skunk. Around midnight, a noise wakes you. It's a mix between a wheeze, a snarl, and a malevolent snicker. You blink blearily toward the chuck wagon, just in time to see a skunk, big as a hog, eyes glinting with pure, unfiltered evil, climb inside. The cook stores are a treasure trove of salted meat and biscuits, and this little monster has claimed it as his own. Deke, the greenhorn, decides he'll be the hero. He grabs a stick, marches toward the wagon, and pokes the skunk. The rest of the cowboys scatter before the first spray even hits. The smell is indescribable. It's like every bad decision you've ever made rolled into a cloud of pure death. It clings to your skin, seeps into your clothes, and mocks the very idea of personal hygiene. The skunk, satisfied, claims the chuck wagon for the rest of the night. Nobody's brave enough to evict it. Biscuit Jim swears vengeance. Deke's banished to sleep downwind, and you spend the remaining hours gagging into your bandana. By dawn, it's still raining. The cattle have scattered. The trail boss looks ready to chew iron nails out of sheer fury. Spite bites you. Twice. You realize you haven't seen a mirror in weeks. But if you did, you'd probably resemble a half-drowned outlaw who lost a bar fight with a swamp. Breakfast is a mixture of burned bacon, skunk-scented biscuits, and one last cup of coffee that tastes faintly like regret in river mud. Nobody says much. What's there to say? You're all half dead, half mad, and entirely resigned to the fact that this cattle drive has turned into a slow-moving nightmare. And it's only getting worse. The trail boss announces that you'll be pushing through to the next watering hole by nightfall. It's 20 miles of swampy, rain-choked hell. The cattle are jumpy. The mud's so deep you lose a boot, and Biscuit Jim mutters increasingly unhinged threats to nature itself. You cross streams swollen to rivers, watch 3 cattle get swept away, and manage to nearly drown twice yourself. You eat lunch standing in mud up to your thighs while trying to stop your horse from murdering you out of boredom. By the time you reach camp that night, you've lost count of the days. You no longer care what's in your food. Your clothes smell like death, the skunk still at large. Biscuit Jim's made a new stew called Whatever I Could Grab, and you eat it gratefully. You fall asleep standing up, wake to a stampede, chase cattle for 2 miles in pitch darkness, trip, fall in a cactus, get up, saddle your horse, ride again. By now you've developed a certain numb acceptance. Cowboy, life isn't about sunsets and freedom. It's about relentless misery punctuated by bizarre animal attacks, terrible food, and the constant threat of death by stupidity. And the worst part? The next morning you saddle up, again, because there's no such thing as quitting on a cattle drive. You either finish the trail or you get buried along it. By this point in the cattle drive, time has lost all meaning. Days bleed into nights. Nights bleed into barely lucid stretches of semi-conscious existence, where you're never quite sure if you're awake, dreaming, or dead, but too stubborn to admit it. Your body is a patchwork of bruises, sunburns, and insect bites, and your mind, a fevered haze of dust, hooves, and the distant sound of Biscuit Jim arguing whether the sun returns with a vengeance. It hangs in the sky like a malevolent god, glaring down as if personally offended by your continued survival. The heat is the kind you feel in your bones, the kind that makes the air shimmer, and your thoughts dissolve into sticky paste. You sweat, but it evaporates instantly, leaving only salt stains on your shirt and a parched ache in your throat. The cattle are miserable. Their eyes glaze, tongues lull, and tempers fray. By mid-morning, a steer named Luther snaps. For reasons known only to bovine psychology, he breaks formation and charges, and where one steer goes, others follow. What begins as a single act of bovine defiance turns into a full-scale cattle mutiny. The herd erupts, a living tsunami of hooves and horns. The trail boss screams. Cowboys grab their hats, their lassos, and whatever vestiges of sanity they have left. You mount Spite, who looks positively thrilled at the prospect of flinging you into a wall of stampeding death. Together, you charge into the chaos. It's impossible to describe what it's like to ride alongside a stampede unless you've personally sprinted through a thunderstorm of angry anvils. The sound alone is deafening. A drumbeat of hooves pounding dirt, punctuated by the occasional bellow of a steer or the shriek of a cowboy whose leg just met a horn at high velocity. You dodge, weave, shout yourself hoarse, and try not to think about the statistical likelihood of survival. Somehow, after what feels like an eternity, the herd calms. You're missing 3 steers, 2 fence posts, and 1 unfortunate mule. Luther is finally subdued by a lasso team and spends the rest of the day glaring like a disgraced outlaw. The sun keeps climbing. By noon, the water supply runs dangerously low. The nearest watering hole, according to the trail boss, is another 10 miles through the brush and heatstroke territory. Several cowboys mutiny, not in an organized way, but through a series of quiet declarations like, "If I die, tell my hat I loved it, and I'm eating my own boot before I take one more step." Biscuit Jim, now speaking exclusively in riddles, offers everyone a ladle of lukewarm mystery stew. No one accepts. The next incident involves gambling. With morale at subterranean levels, someone suggests a game of 5-card draw using saddle buttons and rattlesnake teeth as currency. It's meant to lighten spirits. Instead, it ends with a one-eyed mule named Clem kicking over the card table, breaking a whiskey jug, and causing a brawl that leaves two cowboys concussed and a third vowing to marry a cactus out of spite. The trail boss intervenes by firing his revolver into the air and declaring a mandatory nap. Nobody sleeps. Everyone lies in the dust, baking like sun-dried jerky, and wondering what cosmic offense they committed to deserve this life. That evening, the chuck wagon is late. Biscuit Jim arrives looking haunted, claims he was held hostage by a possum warlord, and serves a meal so indescribable that it's still debated by historians to this day. You eat it anyway, because starvation makes everything edible. Night falls. The coyotes howl. The cattle, unnerved by the heat, the mutiny, and whatever dark energies Biscuit Jim's stew unlocked, grow restless. Another stampede seems inevitable. You volunteer for night watch not out of bravery, but because it's slightly cooler and marginally less awful than lying in your own sweat puddle. The hours crawl. You talk to Spite, who remains aggressively indifferent. The stars blur overhead. You think about home, about real beds and real food and real coffee that doesn't taste like boiled roofing nails. You promise yourself that if you survive this, you'll never complain about anything again. Not weather, not food, not even your neighbor's terrible banjo playing. Dawn comes. The watering hole is within sight. A muddy, fly-infested puddle that smells like expired promises, but it's water. The herd rushes it, nearly trampling 3 men. You drink deeply, not caring that you're sharing it with cattle, insects, and probably ghosts. At camp that night, nobody speaks. The cattle are too exhausted to rebel. The sky is stained pink and orange, and for a brief, deranged moment, it almost feels beautiful. You sit with the other cowboys, broken, filthy, and bonded by mutual trauma. Biscuit. Jim pours one last cup of the world's worst coffee. You drink it. Tastes like victory and mud. The trail boss announces you're 3 days from the railhead. The promise of payday, of saloons, of baths and beds, and whiskey that isn't brewed by a man with active war crimes against culinary decency, keeps you upright. When you finally arrive, dust-caked and half-mad, the town doesn't look like salvation. It's a cluster of sagging buildings and suspicious stairs, but it's dry land. There's a chance to sleep indoors. You dismount Spite, who immediately kicks a bucket and bolts toward a feed trough. The cattle are loaded onto trains. The cowboys scatter. Some head to the saloon. Others find the nearest river. You collapse onto a porch, stare at the sunset, and realize you've survived. Barely. And now you understand why so few made a second cattle drive. Because while the movies promised adventure and glory, what they didn't show was the endless misery, the heat stroke, the stampedes, the skunks, the rivers, the snakes, the bottomless stew, and the sheer, unrelenting absurdity of survival on the open range. And somehow, in the back of your mind, a tiny, treacherous voice whispers you'll probably do it again. Because cowboys might break, bleed, and go half-mad out there. But hell if they don't love a good story. And congratulations, partner. You've just earned yours. Ever thought about what it'd be like to travel back to glorious Aztec Tenochtitlan, wander through the bustling markets, admire the shimmering canals, and then get dragged to the top of a pyramid so a priest can scoop your heart out like a melon? Ball? No? Well, too bad. Because today we're diving headfirst into why you absolutely would not survive as a sacrificial victim in Aztec Tenochtitlan. Part 1. Welcome to the death capital of Mesoamerica. Congratulations. You've time traveled to 15th century Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, jewel of Lake Texcoco, and home to some of the most enthusiastic human sacrifices history has ever recorded. And you, dear viewer, are about to become one of them. You arrive on a bright morning, the scent of maize tamales in the air, the sound of flutes and drums echoing through narrow streets lined with adobe homes. Tenochtitlan is a marvel, a massive city built on water, laced with canals, floating gardens, and causeways leading to stone temples that pierce the sky. It's like Venice if Venice believed the sun would fall out of the sky without a steady diet of human hearts. The locals are polite, friendly even. You might be handed a cup of pulque, a thick milky drink that tastes like fermented regret. And just when you start to relax, a pair of guards in feathered helmets clap you on the shoulder and ask if you'd mind terribly coming along for a little religious observance. You say yes because you're a tourist and you don't want to be rude. Bad move. You are about to learn something fundamental about Aztec society. Everyone had a job, and yours is about to be sacrifice enthusiast. See, the Aztecs believed their gods weren't immortal in the sense we imagine them. No, the gods were like highly demanding cosmic landlords. Pay your dues in blood or the sun stops rising, the crops stop growing. In reality, as you know it, collapses into eternal darkness. No pressure. And so, to keep the universe humming along, they held regular festivals. Lots of them were captured warriors, unlucky locals, and the occasional willing volunteer got turned into spiritual snacks. Guess which category you fall into. The guards march you toward the Templo Mayor, the twin pyramid complex at the city's heart. From afar, it looks majestic. Up close, it smells like blood, sweat, incense, and terror. The steps are steep, the kind of stairs you don't so much climb as crawl up while gasping and silently begging any nearby deity for a reprieve. At the base, a priest greets you. He's wearing jaguar skins, a headdress made of quetzal feathers, and a smile that can only be described as professionally ominous. His teeth are stained crimson, either from ceremonial dye or poor dental hygiene, possibly both. You're stripped of your clothes and anointed with blue paint, marking you as a vessel of sacrifice. Blue was sacred to the gods, a color of life, death, and otherworldly responsibility you neither requested nor deserve. Locals gather, drums pound, and flutes shriek. You're led through a procession of flower-throwing children and wide-eyed market vendors who pause their fish gutting to admire the doomed gringo. Someone offers you a tamale. You wisely decline. Climbing the pyramid is an ordeal in itself. The sun beats down like it's personally offended by your pallor. The stone steps are slick from prior sacrifices. You slip once, catch yourself, and mutter a prayer to literally any god who's taking applications. At the summit, the priest offers you to the gathered masses. It's a big day. Tlacaxtlepolisli, the festival of flayed men, where war captives are sacrificed to Zyptotec, the god of spring and renewal. Which is ironic, since your renewal involves someone removing your epidermis. You're laid on a sacrificial stone. For burly attendants, each with muscles built from years of herding captives and lifting ceremonial knives, hold your limbs in place. The priest raises a blade carved from obsidian, sharp enough to shave the gods themselves. For a moment, you reflect on your life choices. Could have stayed home. Could have minded your own business. Could have ignored that sketchy time portal behind the 7-Eleven. Too late now. The priest plunges the obsidian blade into your chest. It's a swift, practiced motion, equal parts horror and choreography. Your heart is pulled free, steaming in the morning air, and offered skyward. The crowd roars approval. The sun keeps shining. Universe secured. Congratulations. You've completed one of the roughly 20,000 human sacrifices the Aztecs performed every year. Give or take a few unlucky outliers. Your corpse is casually rolled down the steps like a fleshy tumbleweed, where it joins a growing pile of other ex-sacrifices. But here's where it gets interesting. Your heart might be burned, but your body's got further use. Skinning captives was a central part of Zapotec's festival. Priests or young warriors would literally wear the flayed skins for several days, parading around town while flies gathered and children pointed. It was believed the act transferred vitality and fertility to the earth, which sounds poetic if you don't think too hard about the logistics of wearing someone else's moist epidermis in a tropical climate. You, of course, don't get to protest. You're dead. But don't worry. If you'd survived this particular ceremony, there were plenty of other options. Next week's Toxcatl Festival featured the sacrifice of a chosen man impersonating the god Tezcatlipoca. For a full year, he'd live like royalty, adorned with jewelry and escorted by concubines, only to have his heart carved out at the ceremony's climax. A sweet gig right up until the part where you become a cautionary tale. Alternatively, you might have faced the gladiatorial sacrifice. In this charming pastime, captives were tied to a stone disc, given a decorative weapon, think sharpened breadstick, and told to fight 4 elite warriors armed to the teeth. Unsurprisingly, the result was less a contest and more a blood-spattered object lesson in humility. The Aztecs weren't subtle. Unless you assumed this was limited to warriors, commoners too could be sacrificed, especially in times of drought, plague, or political instability. Children were offered to Tlaloc, god of rain, their tears seen as a potent way to summon the waters. Yes, they'd literally terrify children until they cried, then murder them for the good of the crops. A heartwarming community event. So whether you arrived as a visitor, a prisoner, or some random peasant who sneezed near the wrong priest, Tenochtitlan had a creative death package ready for you. And we're just getting started. In part 2, we'll stroll through the infamous Tzompantli, the skull racks where thousands of heads were displayed like macabre trophies. Discover why being too good at sports might get you sacrificed, and meet the delightful human skin-wearing priests of Huitzilopochtli's temple. Spoiler, there will be blood and possibly dismemberment. Stay tuned. By now, you've been thoroughly introduced to Aztec sacrifice culture in all its blood-soaked, organ-yanking glory. But don't start thinking you've seen the worst. No, dear viewer, Tenochtitlan's got plenty of creative ways to unalive you, and several involve your head, whether you're using it to think, to play a ritual ball game, or to decorate a fashionable wall of skulls. Let's begin with the Tzompantli, the skull rack. Picture a giant wooden scaffolding where decapitated heads are mounted on horizontal poles like some nightmarish rotisserie display. The Aztecs believed the human skull was a symbol of life, death, and the cyclical nature of existence. You, however, would probably view it as a very strong argument for relocating to literally any other civilization. These skull racks weren't hidden away. They were prominently displayed in temple courtyards and marketplaces, a friendly reminder that life was fragile, and human sacrifice quotas needed regular fulfillment. Foreign dignitaries, Spaniards included, described them with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. One 16th century observer claimed to have seen racks holding more than 100,000 skulls, And while historians suspect he may have exaggerated a bit because colonial explorers never met a number they didn't wildly inflate, the actual count was still alarmingly high. And if you think that Skull's job is done once it's been thoroughly sun-bleached and displayed for public horror, think again. Some were used as goblets, others as decorative inlays in religious statues. In Tenochtitlan, you could be both an offering and interior decor. Now let's talk about sports. You might assume that being good at a ball game would be your ticket to fame, fortune, and groupies. In most ancient cultures, you'd be right. In Aztec Tenochtitlan, not so much. Here, excelling at the sacred ball game known as Olamalizli could very well make you a prime candidate for ritual sacrifice. The game itself was the combination of soccer, basketball, and near-lethal dodgeball played with a solid rubber ball that weighed as much as a human head. Two teams faced off in a stone court, trying to keep the ball in play using only their hips, elbows, and knees, no hands allowed, which meant that the average match looked like a slapstick comedy performed by the increasingly bruised and desperate athletes. In some cases, especially during festivals, the winning team, or more accurately the star player, was sacrificed to the gods as the ultimate honor. The idea was that their energy and prowess would be gifted directly to the divine realm. There's a small historical debate over whether it was actually the winners or the losers who got sacrificed, but either way it was bad news for someone. And given the alternative of dying on the Zampan Lu or being flayed like last week's festival victim, you'd be wise to fake an injury and limp off the court at the first opportunity. Now, if you weren't talented enough for sports death or unlucky enough to be a war captive, you still weren't safe. The Aztec priesthood had a near insatiable demand for human lives, and they had entire departments devoted to creative sacrificial techniques. One favorite, fire sacrifice. In honor of gods like Zucuticutli, the fire deity, victims would be bound and tossed alive into a blazing bonfire. After a while, typically when the screaming slowed, priests would haul the charred but still living person out and cut out their heart, presumably so the gods could enjoy it medium rare. The victim's remains might then be burned to ash or tossed down temple stairs, where passing market-goers would casually step over them on the way to buy maize. Then they were flaying festivals. Remember Zipitaltech, the god of renewal we met in part 1? Every spring, thousands of victims were sacrificed, and their skin was carefully removed by priests wielding obsidian knives with all the delicacy of a blindfolded butcher. The skins were then worn by other priests like particularly gruesome cloaks for several days. This wasn't just for shock value. It symbolized the earth shedding its old skin and being reborn. Of course, walking around town draped in the fresh skin of your enemies had side effects. The smell, for one. Contemporary sources describe Aztec priests as perpetually blood-stained, reeking of death, and darkly cheerful about their line of work. You didn't become a high priest without first enduring years of rigorous training, including self-mutilation, ritual fasting, and a willingness to hang out in other people's epidermis. Even your bones weren't safe. In certain rituals, long bones were hollowed out, cleaned, and used as flutes in sacred ceremonies. Imagine your femur becoming a musical instrument, playing mournful tunes at the next harvest festival. It's the kind of posthumous career shift nobody asks for, unless you think all this gore was limited to temples and priests. Everyday life in Tenochtitlan was steeped in ritual bloodletting. Nobles, commoners, even children were expected to pierce their ears, tongues, or genitals to offer their own blood on special days. The idea was that personal sacrifice maintained the balance of the world, and it was considered shameful not to bleed for the gods. So even if you dodged the sacrificial altar, you'd still spend half your life dripping into a ceremonial dish like some kind of pre-Columbian goth. And here's the kicker: the Aztecs genuinely believed all this suffering kept the universe alive. Without it, the sun would fall, rivers would dry, and the earth would become a lifeless wasteland. So from their perspective, stabbing you repeatedly was less personal vendetta, more cosmic public service. Coming up in part 3, we'll follow the grisly logistics of a large-scale festival sacrifice, see what it's like being chosen as the divine impersonator with a 365-day expiration date, and witness why stepping on the wrong noble's foot could turn into a very, very bad week. Prepare for more blood, absurdity, and survival odds hovering somewhere between grim and absolutely none. Stay tuned. Excellent. I'm ready to dive in and continue the nightmare. Here's part 3. Part 3. Divine impersonators, blood taxes, and death by minor social offense. By now, you've probably accepted that in Tenochtitlan, life expectancy for anyone not actively holding a ceremonial obsidian knife was astonishingly short. But you might still be thinking, okay, maybe if I lay low, don't play any ball games, avoid the temples, and pretend to be a really boring person, I can quietly survive this place. Allow me to crush that optimism for you. Let's start with the role of the divine impersonator. Easily one of the most bizarre and temporarily enviable jobs in the Aztec world. Every year, the priesthood would select a handsome, physically perfect young man to embody the god Tezcatlipoca, lord of the smoking mirror, patron of sorcerers, night, fate, and chaotic nonsense. This lucky soul would live like royalty for an entire year. He'd wear fine clothes, be fed the best food, and receive adoration from the masses. He was essentially a walking Instagram influencer without the ring light. And yes, concubines. Lots of concubines, because apparently nothing says divine proxy like mandatory seduction. The catch? At the end of the year, he'd be ritually sacrificed. On the big day, our temporary god was stripped of his finery, forced to climb the Templo Mayor, serenaded by flutes and drums, and then had his heart ripped out while the crowds cheered. His corpse was thrown down the pyramid steps like a dropped sack of flour, and a new impersonator was quietly nominated for next year's job. Now, if you thought you could avoid death by simply not being good-looking enough to impersonate a god, bad news again. Because Tenochtitlan also demanded regular blood taxes from its provinces and subjected classes. These weren't metaphorical taxes. They didn't come in the form of maize or cacao beans. No, the empire demanded actual bodies. Conquered cities were required to send a quota of sacrificial victims, and failing to do so could result in your own community being next on the chopping block. Entire towns would be emptied of their youths and warriors, marched to the capital and ceremonially dispatched. It was like jury duty, but with fewer legal protections and way more arterial spread. And what if you were neither an elite nor a captured warrior? Say you were just a regular guy named Xochitl who made excellent tamales and minded his own business. Surely you'd be safe, not remotely. In Aztec society, it was alarmingly easy to offend someone important. Maybe you stepped on a noble's cloak, or you failed to bow deeply enough in the street. Or worse, your pet axolotl looked at a priest funny. Congratulations, you just became a candidate for punitive sacrifice. Small infractions could be punished by beatings or fines, big ones straight to the pyramid. And because Aztec justice was both swift and theatrical, your execution would likely be part of a larger festival. A priest might recite your crime in front of the crowd before offering your head to Huitzilopochtli, a little public moral lesson, bonus points if they made your family watch. Speaking of large festivals, the logistics of mass sacrifice in Tenochtitlan are nothing short of staggering. Take the famous dedication ceremony of the Templo Mayor in 1487. The Emperor Ahuizotl wanted to properly christen his shiny new pyramid. And what better way than with a slaughterfest of truly record-breaking proportions? According to Spanish chroniclers, who, granted, had a flair for the dramatic, over 80,000 victims were sacrificed over 4 days. Modern historians think the number is an exaggeration because logistically, that would have meant one death every 15 seconds without a lunch break. Still, even conservative estimates place the number in the thousands, making it one of the bloodiest religious events in human history. The scene would have been indescribably grisly. Long lines of captives, processions of priests sharpening obsidian blades, rivers of blood running down the pyramid steps, and a crowd of spectators munching on roasted maize and making bets about whose heart would land furthest from the altar. And lest you think victims might be unconscious or sedated to dull the horror, they weren't. The Aztecs believed fear made the offering more potent. The terror in your eyes, the pounding of your heart, the desperation in your final moments. All delicious offerings to the gods. And what if you somehow, through divine intervention or improbable luck, survived one of these ceremonies? Well, your prospects still weren't great. You could be tossed into the ball court for a quick game against jaguar warriors. Or maybe burned alive as a living torch during a new fire ceremony, which marked the end of a 52-year Aztec century and ensured the world wouldn't be devoured by darkness. No pressure. Or, in one of the more artistically grotesque options, your bones might be boiled clean, painted red, and used as ceremonial objects. Your skull could end up as a drinking cup, your femur as a flute, your ribcage strung together as a primitive percussion instrument. Congratulations! Your death would have a legacy whether you liked it or not. In fact, even after death, your journey wasn't over. The Aztecs believed in a multi-layered afterlife, where your soul would travel through dangerous realms, often chased by giant beasts, rivers of blood, and hungry monsters. Unless you died via sacrifice, drowning, childbirth, or as a warrior in battle, your soul might wander for years before reaching Mixtlan, the land of the dead. But if you were sacrificed, straight ticket to Tonatiuhcan, the sun's afterlife, to ride alongside the sun god for eternity. Assuming you didn't mind being reincarnated later as a hummingbird or an iguana. So really, no one got out of this clean. Coming up in Part 4, Final Death Festivals, Accidental Executions, Ritual Cannibalism. Yes, they ate bits of you too. And the sheer inescapable absurdity of trying to survive even a week in a world where every sunrise was basically a death. Lottery. Spoiler. Your odds haven't improved. Stay tuned. Excellent. Let's wrap this horror show up in style. Here's Part 4. Part 4, Cannibal Banquets, Death by Calendar, and the Eternal Nightmare of Tenochtitlan. By now, dear viewer, you've endured obsidian knives, blood taxes, divine impersonators, and punitive decapitations for minor social infractions. You might be thinking, surely it can't get worse. Oh sweet, innocent you. Of course it can. Because if there's one thing the Aztec Empire excelled at besides immaculate city planning and inventive skull storage, it was finding increasingly creative ways to turn human beings into festive confetti. Let's start with ritual cannibalism. Yes, they ate bits of you too. Now, before you picture some dystopia where villagers gnaw on femurs around a campfire, understand this wasn't random gluttony. It was organized, symbolic, and, to the Aztecs, deeply sacred. After certain sacrifices, especially of captured warriors or divine impersonators, select body parts would be cooked and consumed by priests and nobility. The heart was offered to the gods, but limbs and flesh could be stewed or roasted and served as part of ceremonial feasts. This was believed to transfer the victim's strength and divine favor to the eater, sort of like spiritual vitamins, if your vitamins screamed when you removed them from their packaging. And no, you didn't get a say in this arrangement. Once your corpse tumbled down the pyramid, your destiny was entirely at the discretion of whatever high priest happened to be craving long pig stew that day. Then came the death festivals. Aztec society loved a good death party. The Tlaquexipa for instance, wasn't a one-and-done flaying event. It spanned multiple days of sacrifices, parades of skin-wearing priests, and open-air executions. Other festivals, like Huitzilopochtli, involved ritual throat-slitting of children to summon rain, while Panquetzalcoatl called for mass war, captive sacrifices to honor the sun god Huitzilopochtli, and don't forget the new fire ceremony. Every 52 years, when the Aztec calendar completed a full cycle, the people believed the world might end. To prevent cosmic collapse, they extinguished every fire in the empire, sacrificed a victim, and relit the sacred flame in their chest cavity. Only then did new fires spread through the city, and the residents breathed easy, knowing existence had been extended for another half-century of ritual mayhem. And yes, sometimes deaths were accidental. Crowds were massive, ceremonies were hectic, priests were often delirious from fasting, blood loss, they practiced self-mutilation too, and exposure to hallucinogenic mushrooms. In the chaos, it wasn't unheard of for innocent bystanders to be dragged into the mix. Step too close while carrying a basket of maize, and suddenly you're getting a personal tour of the afterlife. And because death here was never just death, your corpse could be used for a dozen bizarre things. Flutes, goblets, wall ornaments, or floating offerings on Lake Texcoco. Some skulls adorned noble homes, others guarded bridges. You could quite literally end up part of the decor. Then there was the constant paranoia. Every eclipse, every drought, every bad harvest was a sign the gods were displeased. The answer, more blood, which meant random human sacrifices outside of festival schedules. No ceremony, no special outfit, just a quick chest puncture to reassure the gods that the locals still respected the chain of command. You couldn't hide, you couldn't flee. Tenochtitlan was surrounded by mountains, lake waters, and religious bureaucracy, and even if you tried to run, neighboring cities were no better. Most had their own death quotas to fill, and a foreigner on the lam was like a walking gift basket to the gods. And if you did miraculously survive a year here, you'd be a trembling, half-mad, blood-smeared wreck with a 3% chance of making it through the next festival week. Your social prospects would be bleak. Your chances of developing a permanent twitch every time a drumbeat started, guaranteed. So in conclusion, no, you wouldn't survive as a sacrificial victim in Tenochtitlan. Not for a day, not for an hour, because no matter how fast you ran, how well you bowed, how average you tried to look, there was always another festival calendar, another god to appease, and another priest sharpening an obsidian blade while muttering prayers to a sun that demanded human fuel. And that, dear viewer, is why your best bet is to stay firmly planted in the 21st century. occasionally lighting a scented candle and sacrificing your dignity to Netflix algorithms instead. Thanks for joining me in this blood-soaked tour through Mesoamerican absurdity. You survived the video, which is more than I can say for anyone in Tenochtitlan. Drop a comment telling me what insane part you found most unhinged. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the most nightmarish, baffling corners of history. I'll see you in the next one, preferably somewhere that doesn't involve ritual disembowelment. Ever wondered what it would have been like to stroll into an Old West saloon, slam a shot of dubious whiskey, charm the piano player, win a poker hand, and maybe tussle with an outlaw or two before swaggering out at sunrise? Well, bad news, partner, because tonight we're unpacking exactly why you wouldn't last a single night in a frontier town saloon. And by the time we're done, you'll be thanking every modern convenience you've got. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Welcome to the American frontier, a dusty, lawless stretch of land where the promise of gold, freedom, and instant wealth attracted the kind of people who either couldn't make it back east or were politely encouraged to leave. The towns here were slapped together overnight, all warped timber, misspelled signs, and saloons that outnumber churches 20-1. And that's where you come in, a bright-eyed, historically naive traveler with visions of swinging doors, tinkling pianos, and friendly games of cards with charming rogues. Your first mistake is assuming the saloon is a fun place. It is not. It is a hostile wooden box full of sweat, smoke, disease, and roughly 30% of the county's current murderers. The air hits you first, a mix of unwashed bodies, tobacco tar, kerosene lantern fumes, and the unmistakable reek of old vomit stewed in dust. If you're lucky, someone's already shot the worst person in the room before you arrived. If not, it'll probably be you. Let's talk about the clientele. Saloon patrons fell into three categories: desperate men too broke to leave town, violent men avoiding the law, people so drunk they barely remembered their own names, and those were the good ones. You'd also find traveling con men, quick-fingered card sharps, and drifters whose only reliable possessions were lice and increasingly desperate debts. Everyone here had a weapon, knives and boots, derringers and coat pockets, and rusted six-shooters hanging heavy on hips. It wasn't if a fight broke out, it was when. The drinks? Absolutely lethal. Forget your artisanal bourbon and small-batch gin. The frontier's whiskey was industrial-grade poison mixed with whatever could be scavenged. Ingredients included wood alcohol, tobacco juice, pepper sauce, burnt sugar for color, and sometimes actual snake venom for an extra kick. Blindness was not an uncommon side effect. A single glass would peel paint off a wagon wheel, but the locals threw it back like water, because, frankly, sobriety in this town was more dangerous than drinking. If you didn't numb yourself, you were left alone with your own thoughts. A fate nobody here was equipped to handle. Food options? Questionable at best. Most saloons offered free lunch with a drink, a marketing trick involving salted meat of uncertain origin, stale bread, and pickled vegetables that may or may not have been last year's harvest. The salt was so heavy it forced patrons to buy more whiskey. And the meat, well, let's just say it had a texture somewhere between jerky and regret. Entertainment came in the form of a battered piano missing several keys, and a player whose musical range veered between depressing ballads about dying in the desert and jaunty tunes about shooting tax collectors. If the town was flush with miners' pay, there might be dancing girls, though calling them girls was generous. Most were former washerwomen, widows, or outlaws' discarded mistresses forced to shimmy for survival. Conversation topics varied. Popular favorites included who cheated at poker last week and got buried behind the livery stable, who caught the latest outbreak of swamp lung, which outlaw gang was currently pillaging nearby settlements, how the town's sheriff mysteriously vanished, probably in several directions at once. Now, if you were foolish enough to order a drink and sit at a card table, congratulations, you've entered a blood sport disguised as leisure. Poker games were equal parts gambling and psychological warfare. Every hand was a negotiation of ego, cheating skill, and who had the fastest draw. If you won too much, you'd be shot. If you lost too often, you'd be accused of cheating and shot. If you simply existed long enough, someone at the table would shoot you on principle. Weapons were drawn for lesser offenses: laughing too loudly, touching someone's drink, glancing at the wrong woman, looking like you talked fancy, breathing. Dueling wasn't some dramatic 10 paces then fire nonsense. It was a twitch of a wrist in a sudden hole where your face used to be. Barroom deaths rarely made it to trial. The local justice system, if it existed, operated on a first-come, best-bribe basis. And yet, the saloon was considered the safest building in town. Why? Because outside it was worse. Wolves, actual wolves, opportunistic bandits, dust, storms thick enough to skin a man alive, diseases without names, cures, or sympathy. In some towns, nighttime meant shutting yourself indoors and praying. Your roof didn't catch fire or your neighbor didn't decide to ask you for your boots. By midnight, the air inside the saloon would be thick enough to chew. Someone would be howling drunk, another man dead, and the floor so sticky with blood and spilled liquor, you'd need a crowbar to pry your boots loose. And you haven't even made it to the sleeping arrangements yet. Spoiler, there aren't any. At best, you'll pay for a corner of the floor upstairs, shared with 2 gambling debts and a man who claims he killed a bear with his teeth. At worst, you'll be stabbed in the outhouse before you ever reach it. And tomorrow you'll do it again because there's nowhere else to go. The next town's a 4-day ride through Apache territory. The stagecoach was robbed 2 weeks ago, and the only map in circulation was last seen being used to patch a leaky roof. And this is just the first 6 hours. In part 2, we'll dive deeper into barroom brawls so violent they made military skirmishes look like summer picnics, meet the notorious whiskey dentist, and find out how many ways you could be conned out of your boots before breakfast. Stay tuned. Part 2, brawls, whiskey dentists, and how to lose everything but your skin. So you've made it 6 hours in a frontier saloon without getting stabbed, shot, or poisoned into a hallucinatory coma. Frankly, that's impressive. But don't get cocky, because after sundown, the real show begins. Let's start with the barroom brawls. You might imagine a couple of drunk cowboys shoving each other, knocking over a table, and exchanging a few theatrical punches before a barkeep shouts, "Take it outside, boys." That's adorable. In reality, these were full-contact, no-rules, multi-weapon death rodeos. A typical fight involved chairs, broken bottles, boot knives, fists, spittoons, and occasionally someone's prosthetic limb. Yes, prosthetic limbs were both practical aids and impromptu bludgeons. One man was famously beaten unconscious with his own wooden leg in Dodge City. Fights broke out over everything: a bad poker hand, A comment about someone's mother. Someone glancing too long at the piano girl, breathing rhythmically in a way deemed disrespectful. And once it started, it didn't stop until half the room was bleeding, and the other half was stripping valuables off the unconscious. Medical attention? Absolutely. In the form of the whiskey dentist. Yes, a traveling dentist with no formal training, carrying a bag full of pliers, rusted saws, and a half-empty jug of rot-gut whiskey. His business model was simple. Knock out your aching tooth with a hammer, pour alcohol on the wound, and charge double if you scream too loudly. Gunshot wounds. Same treatment. You were either patched up on a dirty saloon table or left to marinate in the corner with a bottle in your thoughts. Amputation was alarmingly common. If you had a bullet in your leg, chances were good the saloon's resident hack surgeon would remove both with the same blood-rusted saw, and that's assuming anyone even bothered to treat you. Most injuries in these places were seen as personal problems. If you were gut-shot during a fight, the crowd might clear a small space around you, finish their drinks, and place bets on how long you'd last. Now, if you somehow stayed on your feet and managed to make a little cash at cards, either through dumb luck or sharp-eyed cheating, you'd immediately become the town's newest target. Saloon con men specialized in separating fools from their money. Scams included rigged card games where every deck had 3 aces of spades, shell games using walnut shells weighted with lead shot, a charming lady offering company for the evening, then vanishing with your wallet while you were distracted by the world's worst whiskey hangover. Snake oil salesmen claiming their patent elixir cured everything from snakebite to heartbreak when it was mostly grain alcohol and syrup. And speaking of ladies, the saloon girls were a deadly profession unto themselves. These weren't your Hollywood dance hall darlings. Most were survivors in a world that ate the weak for breakfast. They danced, flirted, and kept drunken brawlers distracted long enough for the bartender to clear his debts. Their job was to charm, manipulate, and, when necessary, defend themselves with hat pins, hairbrushes, and an alarming collection of small knives hidden in improbable places. The smarter ones were also card sharps in disguise, working with a partner to clean out new arrivals. The unlucky ones disappeared into the night, victims of outlaw gangs or aggressive ranchers with more bullets than decency. And if you thought you could drink quietly and mind your business, bad news. Saloon etiquette demanded social interaction. Refusing to answer a question or turn down a drink was seen as suspicious behavior, often warranting a beating or a bullet. Popular questions included, who you riding with? What are you doing in this town? You ain't no lawman, are ya? Is that your horse out front? Translation, it won't be for long. Now, as midnight crept in, the true scum emerged. Outlaw gangs used saloons as recruitment offices, protection rackets, and occasional hunting grounds. The Dalton Gang, the James Younger Boys, the hole-in-the-wall crowd, they all passed through these towns. If you were lucky, you wouldn't be noticed. If you weren't, you might be invited on a midnight robbery you couldn't refuse. Declining often meant a shallow grave behind the blacksmith shop. Sheriffs, if the town had one, typically stayed out of the saloon unless a body needed dragging out. Lawmen here were rarely heroes. Most were reformed or unreformed outlaws themselves, hired for their ability to outshoot the competition rather than uphold any moral code. Bribery was expected, justice was optional. The town undertaker, meanwhile, kept a tab at the bar. Death was good for business, and it wasn't uncommon for a funeral to be arranged before the victim had stopped twitching. sleeping arrangements. Technically, upstairs was a hotel, one large room with dirty mattresses, unwashed blankets, and enough bedbugs to unionize. Privacy was a fantasy. Hygiene, an exotic Eastern concept. Bathrooms were outhouses, located dangerously close to where livestock was slaughtered. The smell could wilt a cactus. Drunk patrons occasionally fell in and drowned. These weren't isolated incidents, and if by some miracle you survived until dawn, you'd stagger out to discover your horse stolen, your pockets empty, and your name now attached to a crime you didn't commit because someone needed a fall guy. And leaving town wasn't as easy as riding off into the sunset. The nearest settlement could be 40 miles of rattlesnake-infested badlands away. Water was scarce, and whatever passed for a road was more a suggestion than a reliable path. Bandits roamed these roads like wolves. The odds of reaching the next town alive were roughly the same as finding a literate outlaw. But even worse, some towns wouldn't let you leave, not until you'd worked off your debt. And if you couldn't pay in money, you paid in labor, often under guard, doing the kind of dangerous, back-breaking work that had killed 3 men already that month. So no, you didn't survive a night in a frontier town saloon. Not without a few broken ribs, a new set of enemies, and a firm conviction that civilization was a lie. In part 3, we'll plunge headfirst into traveling medicine shows. Spoiler, half the doctors were wanted criminals, funeral parlor side hustles, and why drinking water could kill you faster than whiskey. See you there if you're still breathing. Part 3, snake oil, cursed water, and the funeral hustle. So, you've made it through a night of gunfights, poisoned whiskey, crooked poker games, and the kind of brawls that left men with permanent limps and missing ears. You crawl out of the saloon at dawn, half blind from smoke and cheap liquor, and stagger toward what you think is safety. Spoiler, there is none. The first thing you'll notice is that frontier mornings were never peaceful. There's no birdsong, no gentle sunlight breaking through pristine clouds. Instead, you're greeted by a cacophony of livestock fights, hungover howling and someone arguing with a goat. Dust clings to your face like regret, and the main street smells of manure, old blood, and kerosene. The bodies from last night's festivities are either being dragged to the undertaker or simply propped against a fence post with a note. He started it. And now, your next encounter, the traveling medicine show. Imagine a cross between a street preacher, a con artist, and an amateur stage magician. The self-proclaimed doctors rolled into town in godly painted wagons, boasting miraculous cures for everything from cholera to broken hearts. They had elixirs, tonics, and pills made from secret formulas, which, in reality, were usually a thrilling blend of alcohol, turpentine, molasses, and opium. The locals bought them anyway because the water, that was worse. You see, frontier towns were essentially built on shallow graves and livestock droppings. Wells were dug hastily and usually placed within spitting distance of outhouses and slaughterhouses. Drinking water straight was a guaranteed way to meet your ancestors early. Symptoms included cramps, bleeding, hallucinations, and your stomach trying to crawl out through your throat, which made whiskey, ironically, the safer choice. It might blind you, but at least it killed the bacteria. And the medicine shows capitalized on this. Their most popular product? Snake oil. Originally named for a real Chinese remedy using water snake fat, the stuff peddled on the American frontier was just mineral oil and cayenne pepper, sometimes with a shot of cocaine for invigorating properties. The show itself was theater. The doctor would haul out a sickly-looking accomplice, pale, coughing, maybe missing a few teeth. give them a dose of miracle elixir, and within minutes the poor soul would leap into the air, perform a jig, and declare themselves cured. The crowd, desperate for anything resembling hope, would empty their coin purses. By sundown, the wagon was gone, the doctor vanished, and several townsfolk either blind drunk or halfway to the afterlife. And when death inevitably arrived, enter the undertaker. Funeral homes on the frontier doubled as carpenters, dentists, and occasionally bartenders. Because in a town where mortality was as common as dust, it made financial sense to diversify. An undertaker's real business wasn't in dignified burials. It was in renting coffins. Yes, coffins were expensive, and permanent graves weren't guaranteed. Most towns had communal pits or shallow, hastily dug holes. The body was placed in a rented coffin for the public funeral, a chance for the town to make peace with the dead man's drinking debts. And afterward, the coffin was emptied, cleaned, usually not, and reused for the next poor soul. The corpse? Tossed in the dirt, sometimes stacked with others if the ground was too hard to dig deep. In harsh winters, bodies froze before they could be buried, and would be stored in sheds like oddly shaped cordwood. And funerals were rarely solemn affairs. Townsfolk gathered not out of grief, but for spectacle and gossip. Who killed him? Was it that card game? Did the blackjack gang finally settle a score? Some wagered on how long the widow would mourn before remarrying. Others bet on what outfit the undertaker would dig up for the viewing. Black cloth was scarce, so corpses were often dressed in whatever was handy. Old military uniforms, frayed nightshirts, or, on one memorable occasion, a stolen wedding gown. Now, let's discuss the local doctor, assuming there was one. A frontier doctor was less about medical school credentials and more about owning a saw and not fainting at the sight of intestines. Surgery was performed on saloon tables with whiskey as anesthesia and leather straps to keep the patient from kicking a hole through the wall. Infections were rampant. Cleanliness was a myth. Instruments were wiped on apron hems or the nearest curtain, and amputations were distressingly routine for bullet wounds, snake bites, sprains, mysterious aches, or if you owed the wrong person money. Bleeding was a favorite cure for everything from headaches to bad dreams. The theory was that bad blood caused illness, and removing a few pints with a filthy knife would set you right. Often it didn't, but by then the doctor's fee was already collected. And if the doctor failed, which was common, well, back to the undertaker. Because in a frontier town, death wasn't a tragedy. It was Tuesday. And what about law and order? The town sheriff, if sober, might be around, but most lawmen in these parts worked part-time as bounty hunters or brothel investors. Justice was measured in how quickly a corpse could be dumped and whether anyone would bother asking questions. Jails were primitive, consisting of a shack with a heavy door or a simple chain nailed to a post. Escape was easy, and half the town's citizens preferred it that way. Trials were rare. A jury was whatever 12 drunk men could be bribed to sit still for an hour. And then there were pauses, when a crime actually inconvenienced the town, say a stagecoach robbery or a particularly noisy murder. A group of armed men would be slapped together, fueled with whiskey, and sent into the hills. They were less about justice and more about shooting whoever looked guilty from a distance. They rarely brought anyone back alive. In Part 4, we'll wrap up this dusty horror show with public hangings, legendary outlaw scams, and the horrifying story of the Hangman's Saloon, where you could quite literally drink yourself onto the gallows. See you then, assuming you haven't been conned, shot, or married off to a mule trader before sundown. Excellent. Let's drag this whiskey-soaked nightmare to its inevitable conclusion. Here's Part 4. Part 4. Gallows, drinks, public hangings, and how even the winners lost. If you've somehow survived the night, dodged every knife, scam, and lethal sip of varnish-grade whiskey, congratulations. You're either a local legend or extremely lucky. But don't relax yet, because as bad as the frontier nights were, the daylight was worse. Let's start with public hangings, a staple of frontier entertainment. Hangings were treated like county fairs with rope. Word would spread fast, and by noon the whole town turned out, dressed in their semi-cleanest shirts, eager to watch someone's neck attempt a stylish snap. Children sold lemonade. The saloon ran drink specials. Local gamblers placed bets on how Condemned would twitch. And the best viewing spots? Reserved for the town's worst citizens and occasional visiting dignitaries, like corrupt territorial judges or legendary horse thieves in semi-retirement. You might think only the worst criminals got the noose. Nope. You could hang for horse theft, cheating at cards, cussing at the wrong judge, or simply annoying a sheriff with enough whiskey in him to misplace his badge. Due process usually meant you had about 5 minutes to apologize before a rope found its way around your throat. And here's where it gets charmingly macabre. Some saloons actually specialized in gallows drinks. These were last-call cocktails mixed especially for men about to hang. The condemned could request a final drink before their appointment with gravity, often mixed by the very bartender whose watered-down liquor got them into trouble in the first place. It was customary for the crowd to raise a glass as the drop fell, a toast to poor judgment, bad luck, and the thin line between outlaw and legend. Now, as for outlaw scams, no one pulled a con quite like frontier crooks. Besides the usual card games and snake oil, some towns ran full-fledged hoaxes. A favorite involved selling worthless land to newcomers under the promise of future railroad routes. By the time the victim realized the valuable plot was a dried-up creek bed full of rattlesnakes, the seller was halfway to Mexico. One enterprising gang ran a ghost town scam, where they'd stage an abandoned town, sell plots of land to passing settlers, and then loot them as they slept. The settlers, waking to find the entire community vanished, would stagger into the next town and learn that yes, they'd bought property in an illusion. And then there was the notorious Hangman's Saloon, a real place depending on which old-timer you believe. It boasted the distinction of having an actual gallows right behind the bar. If you racked up enough debt or caused enough trouble, the barkeep would ring a small brass bell, signaling to the back room. Within minutes, a crude scaffold was assembled, and you'd find yourself served a last drink as the noose was prepped. This motto allegedly painted above the bar read, "Drink well, die fast." Even in towns without a dedicated hanging post, death lurked around every corner. A man could get shot for asking directions, trampled by a drunken horse, or contract a disease so obscure no one even bothered naming it. Which brings us to perhaps the cruelest irony of all. Even the winners lost. The saloon's best card player, the toughest brawler, the fastest draw, none of them retired comfortably. A man's reputation painted a target on his back. The more you won, the more people wanted to see you bleed, and someone always did. If you lived long enough, you either became a half-mad hermit who shot at tumbleweeds or a hired gun for some crooked cattle baron too cowardly to handle his own business. Dying in bed was so rare it made newspapers. The cycle was relentless. By the end of a week in any frontier town, you'd be broke, infected, drunk, and missing at least one personal belonging, possibly a tooth or a relative. And yet, fresh fools rolled in every day, chasing gold, fame, or freedom only to discover too late that the Wild West wasn't lawless because it was free. It was lawless because everyone who tried to enforce rules got shot in the face. And that, dear viewers, is why you wouldn't last a night or a sunrise in a frontier town saloon. Your modern sensibilities, hygiene standards, and instinct for personal safety would get you killed before the first drink hit your lips. The whiskey was poison, the food was a dare, the law was a suggestion, and the best hope you had was slipping out of town under cover of darkness, preferably on a stolen mule that was slightly less drunk than you. So next time you're sipping an overpriced cocktail in a sanitized, air-conditioned bar while complaining about the Wi-Fi, raise a glass to the poor bastards who bled, gambled, and choked their way through the unhinged carnival that was the American frontier. They didn't die so you could romanticize them. They died because survival there was a sick, bloody joke, and no one was in on it. Thanks for sticking around for this gloriously awful journey. Drop a comment telling me which bit made you the most grateful for indoor plumbing and functioning law enforcement. And if you enjoyed this trip through historical nightmare fuel, hit that like button and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one, hopefully somewhere you're less likely to be stabbed over a card game.